everybody. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOPLP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube station at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and today I'm delighted to welcome Penny Lazarus, renowned piano teacher, and one of her students, Henry Grady.
Hello.
So happy to have you both here.
Thank you.
Well, Penny Lazarus has had and is having a distinguished and diversified career in music. She graduated from the University of Pittsburgh with a triple major in music, psychology, and education. And since that wasn't enough, she also has a master's degree and completed coursework for a doctorate in art history, also from Pittsburgh. She's received numerous awards for her contributions to music education, and she is the very prestigious nationally certified music teacher. She's also published in numerous music education journals, and she presents regularly at national piano teachers conferences. Penny's been teaching piano for more than 30 years and maintains a studio of about 40 students drawn from Newburyport and other locations in Essex County. She runs a creative project-based music studio, and she's here today to talk about their most recent project on American Indigenous composers. So, Penny, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Oh, we're so delighted to be here.
Yeah, and we really appreciate it. It's fun to have you here as well, Henry. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, Penny, first, please tell us what it means to run a project-based studio and how you decided on the theme of your most recent project on American Indigenous compositions for the piano.
I'd be glad to. A project-based studio is, well, I don't know if anyone describes their studios that way, but every year we have a theme that relates to an area of music that's not been thoroughly explored before. And we take a deep dive so that even our theory examples and our music history discussions and even community events that we might participate in all relate back to whatever the project of the year is. So we do consider ourselves a very community-based studio. Students do play anything and everything that they want. There are some students who like to improvise, who prefer to study jazz, although that's not exactly my strength. Some students who only want to study classical music, other are music theater geeks. But everybody will learn one piece that touches with the project of the year. So, we've worked with Eastern European music in a studio in Albania. We worked with a studio on Easter Island. We've worked with other piano studios and composers all over the world. So the Indigenous project started, well, we've been working on widening the canon of music that we study. So instead of just white male European composers, although believe me, Henry has just finished learning and playing exquisitely Beethoven's For Elise.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
That's all still part of our curriculum. But, we've worked with women composers and we've worked with composers of color. And just as we were finishing up that, I was reading an article in one of the teaching magazines about the Indianness. And the article was mistakenly billed as representing Indigenous American music. The Indianness were white. They were late 19th century composers. One name you might recognize is Edward MacDowell, who were writing what they thought Indian music would sound like because they were worried about the disappearing Indian, during the government removal of Native Americans westward. And so I wanted to follow that up. In fact, I called that author and say, what about this title? And she said, you know what? I didn't give it this title. I was really only talking about this group of Indianness, and I would love to write an article about Native American composers and living Native American composers, and that started this project. So we have an article coming out soon about that, and then, of course, our students took a deep dive into this study.
Oh, wonderful. Well, as you took your deep dive, Penny, were there misconceptions that you came across about Native American composers, and what are the corrections you'd like to make in that record?
So, Henry, do you remember one of the things we talked about?
Yeah. During a couple of our last recitals, Penny would talk about the stereotypical sort of indigenous stuff.
And it's based on just a chord of a fifth in the left hand to imitate drumming, and pentascales, of which one of my Native American composer friends, Jerod Tate, said, "Oh, that sounds more Asian to me." Those things never sounded indigenous American, but they are all over the educational teaching books. And they're just by white pedagogy editors, going on for 70 years now, and they have titles called Buffalo Song and Inside a Teepee, and they all go something like da da ba 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 ba, and ba da ba 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 ba. And indigenous music is anything but that. It's as varied and various as any other group of composers. In fact, there's one composer, Joy Harjo. She is a poet laureate. Imagine that.
I recognize that
name.
Yeah.
And she's a musician, and she's a videographer, and she has been accused of composing music that doesn't sound indigenous enough because in her composition she didn't use drums or flute.
Okay, there's the misconceptions, right? And
There's the
and the stereotypes
misconceptions.
right there.
Right there.
Right on the floating on the surface.
Right,
Not
exactly.
hard to see. Yeah. Did you want to add something, Henry?
Yeah, I would say what I would think one of the overall goals of this project was to show most of the students that the indigenous arts and the indigenous musics aren't just what Penny talked about, like the drumming and the stuff. They're wide diversity, and they're much different than you think. I definitely thought that those stereotypical songs were some Indian like stuff, but then on this project happened, and it was like, whoa.
It's a real eye-opener.
This music is very different.
Yeah.
Right. It can be as far-ranging as very contemporary, modern sounds or projects that even are done in the moment, and when the moment is over, the composition is over. It can be impressionist sounding. It can be classically oriented, filled with, Western recognizable tropes, but set against indigenous melodies. And one of the things to keep in mind is there's 574 federally recognized tribes.
That's a lot of diversity.
There's a lot of diversity there. And my indigenous composer friends often say, if I'm Navajo, please don't ask me about the Creek Indians. I have no idea. And there's even more nations in that, because those are only the federally recognized nations. There's nations in every state of the United States.
So that's another misconception. There's a tremendous diversity then that you can hardly hope to capture in any of the conventional stereotypes about drums and more drums.
Exactly.
In fact, these are piano pieces, and I think the piano is, it's not an instrument people generally associate with our stereotypes in any way.
That's
of Native
right.
American music. So.
And that's right. And that's part of the lack of music for students of piano who want to try to change these stereotypes or address them. But then that in itself is a stereotype, because Native Americans can come as well from middle class neighborhoods and homes, as well as living much simpler on a reservation or nearby with a varied lifestyle. So not only have pianos been in composers' homes for a long time who are indigenous, but many Native Americans were, especially with the confluence of early settlers in the United States, were influenced by church hymns. For better or worse, some nations assimilated the two sounds very nicely. In other parts of the tribe specific, particularly in, I can think of some Canadian tribes where the missionaries kind of took over and said, we're not going to listen to your original music. We want you just to sing, hymns from hymnals as we study more about Jesus and the Bible. But one of our composers that we met, Charles Shadle, who is the head of composition at MIT, and so he's just down the road.
Yeah.
A piece, and I had many conversations with him. He came and visited the students, and he talked about how his great grandmother was on the Trail of Tears.
Oh, gosh.
And they actually moved from the state of Georgia to Oklahoma mostly by boat, but most Native Americans who were being moved by the government were on foot and on horseback, or in wagons and such, and it was brutally arduous. And they made this journey, during the winter time. Many people died. So you could only take what was the most important and valuable to you. Do you remember what Charles said his great-great-great-grandmother took with her?
Unfortunately, I do not.
That's okay.
That recital was a little while ago. Or masterclass.
That was during a master class. It was her hymnal.
Oh, gosh, okay.
So, and Charles is Choctaw, and Choctaws really took in Christian hymns and made it their own. So in the Choctaw hymnal, there's almost 200 different examples of a combination of native ceremonial practices with set up in a chord-like fashion as it would be with a Western hymn. So if we would like to hear an example of that,
yes, absolutely,
then I'm going to introduce you to Paz Rivas, who is only a second grader. And she played the melody of a hymn that was shared with us from Chickasaw composer Jerod Tate. And I then played the rest of the chords with her as a duet.
Wonderful. We'll listen to that right now. Well, thank you, Penny, for playing that. That's really interesting. I had no idea. What you say about the hymnals makes perfect sense in terms of that influence on Native American music, but I had no idea. So that's really fascinating. Thank you so much. Well, Let's talk some about the impact that this project had on your students discovering these composers. So, Henry, I guess I'd like to turn to you at this point and say, what was exciting to you, or what kind of impact did it have on you to open up this new world of American Indigenous composers and learn to play a piece?
Well, like I said earlier, before, I never knew the Indigenous pieces being wide variety. And in my time learning that piece, I was like, my goodness, this is sort of difficult to play. But then I actually got into it, and I was like, I sort of feel it. I know what's happening in that piece.
Yeah.
And what was coming back to the idea that the piano is not an original instrument, and that's part of the lack of the music that we have to play as pianists. But composers are now filling in that gap.
Yeah.
And that was part of our project too, working with contemporary composers who are now turning their attention to piano, or like in the case of Chee, he was a prodigy at the piano. He's Diné, part of the Navajo Nation, grew up in, I think, Connor, if you're listening to this, I get this correct, I think you grew up in Arizona, have family in Texas. He played as a prodigy on the piano at Carnegie Hall at 11 years of age.
Oh, my.
So we tend not to think of American Indigenous people of having similar abilities on their instruments to everybody else. And being celebrated, for their gifts. So Connor really works on compositions for piano. But up until now, these pieces have been difficult to play. They're more for intermediate to advancing students. Connor's pieces, even the more accessible ones. Jerod Tate hadn't written for piano yet until he became involved with us in our project and involved with a new project with Chee that's all about trying to encourage living American Indigenous composers to write for young pianists so we can get rid of these stereotypical pieces.
Right.
But Charles Shadle, kind of was one of the early living composers who wrote a set of pieces titled for students not too difficult.
Okay, that's clear.
That's clear. And then what did we find? Because Henry played one of those 4 movements. And it's the series it's 4 movements called Choctaw Animals, not too difficult pieces for young pianists. And what did you think about that label? They were very difficult.
Oh, okay.
And Henry is, one of the advancing students in the studio who I can give challenging pieces to, knowing that he'll be more excited and invigorated to work on because it is challenging, rather than put his hands up and say, I don't know, I think this is too hard for me. So we covered 3 out of those 4 movements, and those 3 students worked harder than ever had worked in their lives to accomplish these pieces. And they did it. And they really, really loved the pieces.
Congratulations.
And so that's why we're so grateful that we get to talk about this project, and that Native American Indigenous composers are interested. We did learn that Indigenous is a word that means of a place.
Okay.
So it can be from any country. So that's why we're really careful. One of the other things we learned is to always say we're talking about Native American Indigenous composers or Indigenous composers of the Americas, because we also pulled in pieces from Canada and from South America.
Wonderful. Well, I'm learning so much today. It's really great. One of the things I've learned is that not too difficult is a relative concept.
Relative concept. And what Charles did, because Charles Shadle came, met with all of my students, heard them play their pieces. We called these unmaster classes because they're very
like
casual. And a student doesn't even have to play the whole piece all the way through. They can just say, would you just listen to me play this first part? Or I'm having trouble with this section.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, Charles Shadle has just now, in the process of publishing, 3 very easy movements in addition to add to his Choctaw animals. And he did that after listening and working with all of our students.
Oh, that's great.
And he talks about our master class in the intro to it, how it influenced him, and he dedicated one of the pieces to us, and we are just so honored.
That is very exciting. What a wonderful experience. Well, we've heard some of your responses, Henry. Are there things some of your other students have said about the impact it had on them?
I have 2 in mind. I'd like to talk about Izzy Soto. Family is Hispanic. And she is in kindergarten. And she did play a reduction that I arranged by Jerod Tate from one of his choral pieces. And with permission from Jerod to just take one of the melodies and just put it in a middle C position for her. And she did a beautiful job. But there have always been stories in her family that they may have had a Native American ancestor.
Oh.
So during this project year, her family, they were all curious enough that they got their DNA analyzed.
Oh, no kidding.
No kidding. And it came back, and she is apparently 1/4 Cherokee.
Oh my gosh, what a discovery to make.
And she came running into the studio, just like a kindergartner student. And she, Teacher Penny, I'm part Cherokee.
Oh.
And I mean, and that's the way all our projects go. We become enamored with the music of all, and in fact, Henry used the term, I don't know if you caught it, he called it musics.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
from all over the world, and we come to love them and admire them and
Wonderful.
take them to heart. And she was really taking this lesson to heart. What I do have to say to her, though, what I haven't really said yet because she's so young, is she would not be considered a tribal native. That's a very specific thing.
Yeah.
And they don't accept the DNA tests as membership in a tribal nation.
Interesting.
So the family can be an ally, and that's a very specific word accepted by tribal nations. But they would have to go back and see if they can trace ancestry, if they can really show that they have an indigenous American ancestor.
I see.
Then they can apply for tribal citizenship.
So the DNA isn't enough. You'd have to have a family tree that connected you. Well, that's really interesting. I'm learning so much.
And we did too.
Yeah.
Could I add something?
Yeah, of course, Henry.
So, like Teacher Penny mentioned, the song that she played, Sunrise, from a children's song by Jerod Tate from Tallua Chapulta. And I was in the junior district, and we sung a choral piece that was from Tallua Chapulta.
Oh, wow.
So me and my mom looked at it, and I was like, I know that song.
Oh, interesting.
And that song definitely had that indigenous vibe to it.
Okay.
It was Turtle Shells.
Oh.
I forget what it was called in its language.
Because many of these composers will use the Chickasaw language or the Choctaw language, so they want to keep the language alive as well. But we discovered this before the recital, and it was like, Jerod Tate? Jerod Tate? That's the same person.
He's out there.
He is out there.
That's exciting. What a good discovery to make. Well, you both mentioned the recital a number of times, and I was hoping you could tell us more about that. I think it was June 11th, you had this recital at St. Paul's, and perhaps then after telling us more about the recital, I think you have some more clips that you can play for us.
We do. divided the recital into 5 sections so that the groupings of pieces kind of made sense. And it was grateful for the day, and that's why the Choctaw hymn opened the program.
Yeah.
There was ceremony and ritual. There was a section called Spirit Animals because many of the pieces were about animals that were important to folktale myths. So Henry, we're going to listen to him play one of the movements from Charles Shadle's Choctaw Animals, and he was given the movement titled
Wolf.
Okay.
Or Nashoba in the
Oh.
language.
right in the Choctaw language.
Yeah.
Do you want to say just a little description about wolf and how you feel it described the wolf, and maybe what Charles said to you during the master class?
Yeah, so I'd say the piece that I learned had a lot of ups and downs. And when we do listen to it, you actually hear those ups and downs. So one of the key points that Charles actually mentioned was a pause in the music. There's a small pause after an up, so it goes from up to just dropping, and then it sort of quiets almost. And we actually made up sort of a story of the wolf and what's happening with the wolf through the story, crawling out of its little home,
Then, yeah.
maybe chasing down something,
Yeah.
dragging it back,
Yeah. Well, that sounds really cool.
Exactly. And it actually has a very classical structure.
Okay.
It's very much based on a Bach fugue. You can hear the
Interesting.
wolf, appearing and then disappearing and coming back again. And
Well,
we
let's-
could trace all of that.
Let's play the clip then. Well, thank you so much for playing that clip. What an intriguing piece, and what a great story you have to tell about how you learned it. That's really great. Are there other clips or stories you want to tell from the recital?
we have the next clip that would like to introduce, with a minute or two. Sam Lemoine is playing from a set of pieces by Chee.
Okay.
And Chee was the prodigy that we spoke about at Carnegie Hall. I've had the pleasure of meeting Chee at several national teaching conventions, and he speaks all the time about this music and about the stereotypes about the music. He's just wonderfully eclectic in his writing of music, and his sand painting pieces, the one that Sam Lemoine, the piece that we'll listen to, is called White Shell.
Okay.
And of course, sand painting is an indigenous art that was meant to be temporal. Because you would do it in sand with, colored dyes, and then the wind would blow it away.
Oh, it's like a Tibetan sand mandala.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And they're very sacred. So the ones you buy at, markets for tourists, those are set in glue, but that's not the original.
Yeah.
But you'll hear in Sam's playing of sand painting number 1, it's like as if you're holding the show up to your ear, and he plays a melody that kind of makes this kind of circular sound. And then as he continues to play, it gets richer and richer and more impressionistic, and there's vibrations going on from all over the piano, and the strings start to vibrate in sympathetic harmony, and it's almost like listening to those echoes deep into the shell. I don't know that that's what Connor meant, but that's what it meant to my student who played it, and I can't help but to think that Connor would be pleased.
Well, let's listen to Sand Painting then by Sam Lemoine. Well, thanks again for bringing it. It sounds like such an amazing recital that you had. And there's one more piece. I understand the concert included a piece with the intriguing title, Raccoon Talk. That got my attention. and I'm hoping, well, you're both smiling, so I know there's a story there.
This is going to be a fun
Tell
section.
us about it.
Okay, so Raccoon Talk is by Chickasaw composer Jerod Tate. And that
I'm
took
so
a lot of
impressed you can
practice.
say that. Because I've seen it spelled out, and I would
Trusting
never have
that
gotten
5
there.
times fast.
And because up to now, Jerod hadn't written for piano, but we've had many Zoom discussions and email discussions back and forth. And so looking for pieces for enough of my students to play, especially the young beginning ones, I had to beg Jerod, can we please take, this is a violin piece, would you please let me take a few snippets from some of your other pieces and pare it down for my beginning students? Because so far, until Connor Chee's work comes out, there's nothing really for them to play that's authentic. So we will listen to a tiny bit of second grader Levi Irose playing the melody from Raccoon Talk.
All right, bring on Raccoon Talk. Well, thank you very much for bringing Raccoon Talk to us. I appreciate it.
But then we couldn't just let it go at that because it's a full-length piece. It's like almost 15 minutes. It's with audience participation and solo violin. It was like, oh, we've got to do this. We've got to end our recital program with this. So then finding a violinist who could play this very complicated piece, we were so lucky we did. Arjan Mudan had just played this piece in a contemporary composers festival in Boston.
Oh, no kidding.
And he was free, and he came up and played it. And what were some of the audience participation parts?
So there was one part where we would stomp. I don't remember exactly the order, but I remember what we did. So there was one part where we'd stomp
our foot?
and then we'd stomp our foot. Then there was one part where we had to snap.
Our fingers.
And then there was another part we had to whisper the word chatter over and over
Again. I was so much fun.
like that.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
It was. Everybody loved it.
I bet,
And what a
yeah.
great end
Yeah.
to the recital.
sounds wonderful. What fun. Well, Penny, I happen to know that you went to Oklahoma City recently as part of the project. Please tell us about that trip, whom you met and what you learned.
So that trip was to meet with Jerod Tate. And because part of our project every year, no matter the topic, is we have a fundraising component.
Yeah.
So it's either to support something going on in a sister studio or to support composers to compose things that are a lack in the music that we study. So Jerod runs, he's done it twice now, a summer camp for composition at the very new First Americans Museum in Oklahoma City. It's only 5 years old. If you get there, it's a fabulous museum, and they have the most gorgeous concert hall. It was just beautiful, and they do all kinds of projects. They have a permanent collection that talks about the number of indigenous communities that are in Oklahoma. So that was a prime place where the government forced move Eastern nations to the West. And so we raise money by practicing at 5 cents a minute over a 6-week period.
Okay.
And students kept track of their practice minutes. Henry's done it for many years. He's always a top practicer. And we supported the purchase of keyboards, electric keyboards, for the composer class.
How great is that?
Because he had 7 students, he needed 7 keyboards. And we raised more money this year than we've ever raised before. And we've raised money for some very, very, heartful causes. And we were so proud to top it off at $2,000.
Well, that's impressive.
And so,
and what a wonderful gift.
Right. And so we got to see photos of students working with their keyboards. Jerod would have them meet together and talk about composing or how to get started. They'd all each go off to their work tables with headphones and their keyboards. Because he had connections with a string quartet made up of Oklahoma City symphony players. He had each student write a short movement for a string quartet.
Oh, wow.
And we're talking about students Henry's age, early high school, and you won't believe the pieces that they wrote. If you want to hear more, you can find Jerod Tate on Facebook. But we'll listen to one piece written by violinist. Where is... there it is. She's a 8th grade violin student, so she's very familiar with her high school orchestra, violin components of those pieces. And her name is Arielle Hines-Lunn. She lived so far away in Oklahoma that she and her father traveled and stayed the week in Oklahoma City to complete this course. Wow. We're going to hear more from this student. She's definitely an up-and-coming composer, even though she's in 8th grade. And her piece is called Seasons Theme in A minor.
Let's bring on the clip then. Thank you so much for bringing that clip, and what an amazing experience to have, and how gratifying it must be to know that the fundraising that you did has contributed to the learning experience of these young composers, but also to all of us, because it sounds as though we're going to hear more from Arielle and others, which is so exciting,
this
wonderful
program. And it was wonderful to meet Jerod Tate. I was walking down the edge of the circle of the museum, because it's kind of in a organic shape, and then coming in the opposite direction was Jerod, and I could tell who he was and he could tell who I was, but we're just remembering our Zoom heads, and it was just such a joy, immediate hug, and I was introduced and allowed to talk about our program to the audience there. And if we're going to end soon, I was able to have this discussion with Jerod, which really wraps up a lot of what we learned about Native American indigenous music. So as varied as the sounds are, from complicated to simple, from harking back to one's nationality and childhood raising to just being out there on the edge of what we even recognize as music, or being classically oriented, I had this sense that there was this one thing, if I had to pick out, that seems common to this entire range of music. And Jerod was so kind to say, yes, there is an ethos. And that sense is that in the music we became familiar with is a sense of timing, time standing still, learning to be in place and in the moment. A lot of these pieces allow you to do that.
Interesting.
And there's an ode to nature throughout all of them, even if it's just not exactly expressed in the title. But you can get a sense already. We talked about spirit animals and we talked about sand paintings.
Yeah.
And there's this, this sense of honor to the earth and nature. And Jerod said, yes, there is an ethos.
So he affirmed what you had been.
Confirmed,
Yeah.
and we're so grateful to have experienced it this year.
Well, it sounds like such a wonderful, really inspired project. I'm so impressed, and I've learned so much from both of you. So thank you very much, teacher Penny and student Henry.
And Jerod Tate and Charles Shadle and Connor Chee. And if you want to listen to the father of Native American piano music, that is Louis Ballard, who lived from 1931 to 2007. He's Quapaw and Cherokee, and his music is just wonderful. Too hard for our students to learn, but to listen to nonetheless. We should all know him.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Thank you both so much. I wish I'd been at the recital is what I'm left with. I really, really appreciate your taking the time to come here and to share what sounds like a very impactful, very gratifying experience musically and humanly. So it's really wonderful. And you're filling in important parts not only of music world, but also of American history. And so I'm grateful to you for that. And I thank you for that. And I also thank you so much, Teacher Penny and Student Henry, for taking time to visit the morning show and to share your experiences with us. I really appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been my pleasure. Well, that's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, be well. Listen to some music and see if you can find some American indigenous music. All right, everybody, that's it. Farewell.